Every time I think about chamber pots being thrown out the windows, I'm always like, how many times did that land on a person down below?
Hi, I'm Chansey,
And I'm Lila.
and this is for Criming Out Loud.
Welcome to this week's episode. And I'm gonna share a random fact here in a second, but before I share my really not that cool random fact that for some reason has stuck with me, I just have to say that every time I say my name ever in my life, I feel like it slurs. I feel like when I say my name, there's no way to enunciate it. You know what I mean? Do you ever feel that way when you say my name?
Lila. I don't
It's like
know.
when I say it because I think, I don't know. It's like, whoa, like that? That's
I
how I
can
feel every time like I introduce myself to somebody. I'm always like, yeah, and they're like, what? I'm like, sorry, Lila?
Lila.
Anyway, that was just and
I
every time I introduce myself on the podcast, I feel like I do the same thing. Like it comes out like a then it's over.
as a person who hears you say your name every week, I just don't see what you're talking about, but
Okay, well that's good because I feel like I'm doing some kind of a weird like walrus mating call or something every time I say my name. So it's all good in the hood. Okay.
well,
Anyway, my
we're
fact
good.
that I am bringing to you guys this week that has nothing to do with anything is that did you know that giraffes have the same amount of neck bones as humans? And that is 7 of them.
They only have 7 neck bones?
They only have 7 neck bones, which is the same amount that we have, and yet their necks are obviously much longer than ours.
I don't know. I have a pretty long neck. I've
I
often
do
thought
too.
I have a
I was
giraffe-like
like,
neck.
I think I relate a little bit, but
I feel like I get it. No, but that's
uh,
crazy. They must have really long bones then, because their necks are like 6 feet tall.
apparently.
So
I'm sure it's like much
it's pretty
easier for
crazy.
them to like break their neck than with that long of a bone in their neck. With
Yeah,
our
I
like
mean,
little bones, we have a lot more like flexibility in there, but
yeah. I mean, you would think so, but I sent a video to you that nobody like I sent a video to our siblings group chat and literally nobody responded to it. I thought it was hilarious and everybody just ignored me. So that was fun. But it was a video of giraffes fighting and they fight with their necks. They use them like
yeah, they do.
clubs.
I've seen that. I didn't see your video. Thus
That's
the
okay.
not
People
response,
ignore me.
but
It's fine.
whatever. Anyway, so yeah, no, they do. But maybe it's cuz it's like maybe that's their most deadly form
I
of
mean, it is pretty
fighting.
brutal. It's like a 6 foot long weapon.
Sledgehammer just
It's just like
swinging
their necks
around.
can't be that fragile if they're using them to try and murder other giraffes. You know what I mean? I don't know.
That's true. That's true. Anyway, there you go.
Anyways,
Now you can walk around the
random
planet
fact.
knowing that you have as many neck bones as a giraffe.
Try not to take it too hard. But yeah. Oh, goodness. You know, sometimes it's like we can try and find a segue from giraffe bones to murder. And other times I just have nothing. There's no segue for that. So
Yeah,
I'm just
there's
gonna
really not.
I'm just gonna
Just
get
gotta
into
get
it.
into
I'm
that
just
one.
gonna jump right in, feet first. There's nothing relating giraffe bones to this case, so I'm just gonna talk about it. Um, Today's case was requested by a friend of the pod, Ryan. She's been like our number one fan for forever, so I decided I was gonna do a case that she requested. So shout out to Ryan. This is for you. Okay, so today we're gonna be talking about a serial killer. We're going to be talking about Jack the Ripper. And this is like everybody knows the serial killer. People that have never heard the words true crime know who Jack the Ripper is. So Well, actually, nobody knows who he is. They've heard of this person. I feel like Jack the Ripper has just kind of been mainstreamed and it gets talked about a lot. And so I don't have a lot of like interest in it because I know the basics of it. And so I've never felt a need to like dive into it. But
Right.
it's actually it's pretty crazy. Like there's just some details about it and I kind of after researching it get why people get so hooked in because it is just like kind of insane that he was never caught. Like considering all the details that we will talk about in just a minute. But I actually really enjoyed researching this case cuz there were some things that I didn't know. So, here we go. Jack the Ripper. And I also just I know that people sometimes tell me that I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyways. I just want to put a trigger warning out there. This is probably the most graphic case we have talked about. And when I say graphic, I mean like it's super gruesome. Think like the worst episode of Criminal Minds you've ever seen on steroids. So if you're not into that, that's fine. Skip the episode. We understand. But I am going to talk about some pretty gruesome stuff that happened to these women's bodies. So there you go. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in the Whitechapel district of London, England, in case people didn't know where London was, in 1888. So we're going like 200 years ago, sort of. And at the time that these murders occurred, he was known as the Whitechapel Murderer or Leather Apron. He was not known as Jack the Ripper. So just an
Leather
interesting
apron.
little factoid. I
I've
think
never
that's
heard that before.
because I hadn't heard that either. I think it's because they found a leather apron at one of the scenes, but I'm not sure. I couldn't actually find a
Okay.
reason why they called him that back then, but that was one of his names, Leather Apron. I'm not gonna lie, that's kind of like scary. That's scarier than just like straight up naming him like a murderer. Like Leather Apron, what does that mean? That's horrifying. Anyways,
Or is it less horrifying? All I can think of is like a weird chef.
I was thinking like a butcher. Don't butchers wear like those super intense
Yeah, you're probably right.
apron thingies? I don't know. I don't know. Okay. And he is Jack the Ripper has always been assumed to be a he, I guess, since there's no definitive evidence it could be a she. But for the
But
purposes of this
also,
episode,
there's many a woman that has been overpowered, obviously.
yeah. So,
So you kind of have to assume it's a man.
yeah. Police, after their investigation, they thought it was a he. And there's a few reasons for that, not just like stereotypes. But, anyways, because he communicated with police, at least they think he did, and he always was a he in those communications. So, anyways, they think that he's responsible for 5 women's deaths, but there's also 6 other women who were murdered in this same year that kind of get swept into the Jack the Ripper victim pool. And so we're going to talk about all 11 murders and we'll just go more into depth about the ones that we actually know Jack the Ripper committed because he committed 5. But before we get into the murders, I like to have some context for what we're talking about, especially in a case that's from like forever ago. So I'm going to do some background. And if you are not interested in that, then skip ahead 30 seconds. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about it because I think it's interesting. At this time in England's history, in the mid 19th century, there were like a lot of immigrants in England's major cities because in 1882, 6 years earlier, there were tons of Jewish refugees that had been fleeing from the Russian Empire and some Eastern European countries into England. So there was like tons and tons of people, and London was super overcrowded. And that includes the Whitechapel district. In the Whitechapel district, which is not very big, it's just the east end of London, there were 80,000 people just in that one area of London. So for 1888, that's pretty overcrowded. And because it was overcrowded, there was lots of poverty, and working and housing conditions were horrible. And basically, there was just like a huge economic disparity between like the normal class people, and there was just like a huge pool of impoverished people, and there was like a huge disparity between the two. And like, if you just picture like Oliver Twist or A Christmas Carol, you're probably on the right track with what it was like. Like old England, super gross, dirty. People are throwing their chamber pots out the window
Out the
onto the
window.
streets. And with
Yum.
there being like 80,000 people stacked on top of each other in a little corner of London, it's just nasty. It's just not great.
Yeah, not that
And
anybody needs this in their life, but every time I think about chamber pots being thrown out the windows, I'm always like, how many times did that land on a person down below?
yeah, was that
Like,
just
wouldn't
like a
you have
normal
been
part
like
of your
afraid
day?
to walk down the street? You
Yeah,
might get somebody's like piss or crap thrown on you. That's disgusting. What are we
yeah. Like, was that
glad
just
we moved
like,
away from that?
I know, was like a normal
Thank you
hazard
for
that you just
toilets.
encountered? Was it like, how many times am I gonna get thrown chamber pots thrown on me today? How many times will those be emptied onto my person in one day? Like, that's just horrible. What a terrible way to live.
Yuck.
Um, and conditions were so bad that in this area, 55% of children who were born in this area at this time, they died before they turned 5 years old. So like
Whoa.
the survival rate for people was not great at this
Wow,
time.
I had no clue.
Yeah, I didn't either. I didn't either. And as you can imagine, with all of these terrible conditions comes a lot of human desperation and therefore a lot of crime. So there was a lot of violent and nonviolent crimes going on. There was a lot of alcohol use because, I mean, I get it. Like, you're living in squalor. So I don't know. I'd turn to alcohol too, maybe. Who knows? But basically, there was just like a lot of horribleness going on. And at the time, there were a lot of women who didn't have husbands to provide for them, who were turning to sex work to try and survive and keep food in their bellies and keep a roof over their head, and sometimes to provide for their children. And so, women back then, this is 1888, it's not 2024. So, they didn't have very many options to make money. There was not a lot that they could do. And so, sex work became kind of like their big career move so that they could afford to have a bed to sleep in. And at the time that this occurred in 1888, there were like 62 brothels operating in Whitechapel alone,
Whoa!
which seems like a lot. I don't know. That
That's a
seems
lot
like
of
a lot to me.
prostitutes.
Yeah,
Just
and
using the term they
in
used back then.
yes.
That sounded bad. I just meant what they would have called
Yes.
them.
No, yeah. Well, there were, because according to some of the research I did, there were like 1,200 sex workers on the streets just like every night
Gee.
trying to make a buck. And a lot of these women were living day by day making money so that they could turn around and spend that money to have a bed in a lodging house. Like, it was like a hostel situation almost. These common lodging houses were super popular, and people didn't just like own homes or have apartments. They had to like buy beds nightly. And so these women would go out and they'd work, and then they'd come back and spend the money that they worked for so that they could have a bed at night, and then they'd do the same thing the next morning. So this is just like a really sad painting I just painted for you.
Yeah, it really is. It's like
That
sad
like
that like that was the only choice women had. Like if they wanted a job, if they wanted to not like die on the streets, it was like you're only good for sex. Have at it.
yeah. Yeah, it's
Cool.
actually like super horrible. Like super horrible. But as you can imagine, there were, with these economic problems and this kind of general environment that these issues created, there was a lot of social tensions going on between the impoverished people and the not impoverished people. And there was a lot of rioting against people just trying to do their best, you know? So, um, there were like riots against people of color, there were riots against Jewish people, there were riots against sex
It's always those
workers.
two groups of people, right?
Well, I don't
Oh
know
my
why,
gosh.
but
Whatever.
people just can't leave well enough alone and just let people live their lives. Whatever. So, life is just not great if you're an 1888 woman, basically. And one strange thing is that there were hardly any murders reported at all, ever. And some people think that there just weren't any murders, but I'm not quite that optimistic. I think
No,
that they
there's no
just
way.
didn't get reported. Like with these kind of like I don't know, this kind of
Living
environment.
conditions? Yeah.
Yeah, and then you've got there's violent crime happening all around you. People like human desperation does not lead to like super hopeful, happy interactions. It leads to lots of violence. So it's strange to me because in 1887, the year before Jack the Ripper started killing, there was only one reported murder. Just one,
Hmm.
which just doesn't seem possible to me. But
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
I think what's likely happening is that they just didn't have a very good system for like investigating and reporting murder. I think that the murders were happening. I think that it was hard to tell if somebody was murdered because they didn't have the investigative and forensic knowledge and tools that we have today. And so I think there were probably a lot of people that were murdered that just didn't get like it wasn't labeled a murder because
Yeah,
like it
well,
was just
and you also have like the fact that, I mean, history is what it is and it repeats this fact over and over, but the poor don't really get access to reporting crimes as much as wealthy people do. And I'm sure
yeah,
all the people
exactly.
being murdered at the time were probably, for the most part, the ones living on the streets.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You're so right. And basically like there were lots of deaths recorded, you know, just like normal deaths. But I think even to get like from what I understand, and I could be wrong, and if somebody's a history buff out there, you let me know and you correct me. But from what I read, in order to get an autopsy done, a coroner had to be paid like by the autopsy. So like if the police didn't think that there was anything going on, like an autopsy was never going to get done. They weren't actually going to do an
Hmm,
investigation because they had to
interesting.
pay the coroner specifically for each body that he autopsied.
I mean, I
So,
guess it makes sense, but
yeah, but it's just another like money rules the world thing where it's like it would be
yeah.
nice if there's something weird about a crime that it just gets investigated instead of playing money games. But anyways, I've now set the scene for you. This is the stage, the backdrop, if you will, of the Jack the Ripper murders.
Really, really dim outlook here, people.
Literally super dim. There was no such thing as street lamps back there. It was just darkness everywhere. So, I'm going to talk about the 5 women that we can 100% attribute to Jack the Ripper. I'm going to talk about their murders
Okay.
first because they all have like it's clear once you like learn about their deaths that it was the same person that killed them. And I don't know how this became a thing, but these 5 women, they're known as the canonical 5 murder victims of Jack the Ripper. They're always labeled as the canonical 5. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And this is a
They all
super
sound
random
like
side note.
famous people.
I know, right? Don't those names sound like super dope? Mary Ann Nichols
Those are like
and
gorgeous
Jacqueline.
names. Like
Yeah.
if somebody found me down the street, Lila Smith, what is that?
I mean, you have a beautiful name too. You got this. You're good.
Having name
Somebody
envy,
will.
it's fine. I like my first name. I feel like I've thrown a lot of shade in this episode on my name. I mean, no
Yeah.
offense to my name. I like my first name, but even my husband knows that I never did want to become a Smith. There's too many of us out there.
Yeah. There are a lot of Smiths. I get that.
So,
I mean,
anyway,
I don't because I'm
beautiful
not a
names.
Smith, but yeah. Well, hopefully someday somebody after you're murdered thinks you have a beautiful name. I guess that's the goal here.
Thanks for wishing murder
Um,
upon me.
you're welcome. Seems like you were wishing it upon yourself, and I was just like jumping on the bandwagon, but that's okay. Okay, so on August 31st in 1888, there were two Carmen. That's not the name Carmen. Shout out to Carmen, who's awesome. That's a job that people had back in the day. Car dash men.
Oh. Yeah, I 100% heard the name Carmen.
Yeah, that's why
Car,
I
pause,
dash
men.
men. That's why
Got
I
it.
thought I'd expound on it because yeah. So basically Carmen, car dash men, they're men that drove horse carts. So it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
But um these two Carmen were passing by like a secluded yard at a place called Bucks Row. I'm going to be honest here. There's a lot of like street names and all sorts of stuff. I don't know geographically where any of this stuff is. I have no idea if it's still even a thing, but I'm just going to say it and maybe people will be like, "Yeah, that makes sense," or maybe not. But don't at me about it. I don't want to hear it. Okay. So, they were passing Bucks Row when they saw the body of a woman on the ground. And it was like 3:40 to 3:45 a.m. at this time. And I'm just going to also I'm sorry, there's so many side notes here, but it seems pretty common for people to be working at 3:40 a.m. at this time. And I just like am grateful that we moved past that. Apparently that was like an old-timey thing and I don't like it.
I wake up at 6 a.m. every morning and I will confidently say it's too early.
Yeah,
So,
like that's just not a thing that I want to be part of. 3:45 a.m. Anyways, so like I said, 3:40 to 3:45 a.m. they saw her body and they thought that she was still alive, so they just ran off to go find police. And while they were doing that, actually another police constable came across her body. And so they had like tons of police show up. And they found that she was in fact not alive and little did they know that this was just the beginning for Jack the Ripper. When they examined her body, they found that she was still warm when she was found and she had blood still coming from wounds in her
oh,
throat.
whoa.
So she had been slashed from ear to ear and it seemed like it had literally just happened. Like it was still like a fresh scene. And so they found also at the scene that her bonnet was lying like on the right side of her body and her clothes were kind of messed up. She was wearing a brown dress and she had a looking glass, a comb, and a white handkerchief with her when she died. And so that's kind of like the scene that they came upon. And the women, they were able to identify her as Mary Ann Nichols, and she was a local sex worker. And she was 43 years old. She was about 5'2". She had dark hair, and she was known to kind of be a heavy drinker. And she had been separated from her husband for about 9 years. So she was just kind of
Dang.
known around town
Not in the
for those
best time of her
things.
life.
No, none of these women were, which is really sad. And the last time she'd been seen, it was around 12:30 a.m. on August 31st. She'd been seen at the common lodging house that she was known to reside in. And a witness saw her and said that she spoke to Mary, and that Mary said that she didn't have enough money to stay the night at the common lodging house, so she was going to go out and work, get some money, and then come back. And so the witness saw her leave and said that she was drunk when she left. And after 2:30 a.m., nobody knows where she was. She was seen a couple other times, but at 2:30 a.m., nobody saw her. And there was nobody heard anything in this area. Nobody heard any noises or screams or anything to indicate that she was being hurt. And then she was found like just a few minutes after the attack, they believe. So it all happened really fast. It seems like she was walking around, she was fine, and then she was dead, and people found her really fast.
Okay.
So just a little bit more detail about how she was found, what the scene of the crime looked like. She was lying on her back, and her clothes had been pushed up to her stomach. And one of the witnesses actually at the scene, they were uncomfortable with her being exposed, so they pushed her clothing back down. But she was like kind of posed with her legs like drawn up and spread, and her clothing like up around her stomach. So that's not great.
Okay.
Obviously, nowadays, we know that touching anything at a crime scene is just like the dumbest thing ever. But this is 1888, not modern times. So they didn't have forensics available to them and knowledge of that stuff like we do. So suffice it to say that the evidence and the scenes were not well preserved. There wasn't a lot of stuff to be taken from the scenes. But an autopsy was actually pretty revealing. They were able to tell that Mary's throat had been cut from left to right, and that there were 2 cuts on her throat, not just one. And her windpipe had been completely severed down to her spinal cord. Even her spinal cord had been cut, and she was basically decapitated, which is just like, it's
Gruesome.
just so brutal.
Okay.
And they believed that the weapon that had been used to do this was like a sharp knife that was about 8 inches long. And she also had some bruising on her lower right jaw and other bruises on her left cheek. And these seemed to indicate that her face had been grabbed. That's what they assumed these bruises meant. And the most interesting thing that will be a theme for all of these murders is that there were no defensive wounds. Like, no struggle had taken place, which seems to indicate that she had very little time to react to the attack before her throat was slit. Like, it was just over like that.
Well, I mean, the scene that's playing out in my mind is she's a sex worker. She starts to do her job, and then something happens.
Yeah. Well, and
I mean, I guess back then, could they tell? They couldn't tell if like she had had sex, right? There's no way of knowing that.
I don't think they could tell if she had consensual sex, but they were able to tell that she had not been sexually assaulted in any way. So there was no sexual assault as like a factor.
Interesting.
And that'll be a theme for all of these murders as well. There was no sexual assault to any of them, but I would say that there's still some sexual components, and we'll talk about it. But this part that I'm about to say, this is the graphic stuff. So just strap in or skip ahead like a minute and a half. Not only had her throat been cut, and this was the cause of death, so they believed that her throat had been cut and she had bled out within basically seconds because her carotid artery had been nicked. So she was dead when this next thing happened, which is a mercy. But the killer had like cut open her abdomen starting at the bottom of her ribs and basically opened her abdominal cavity, and then had taken parts of the lining of her stomach and other parts of her organs and removed them from her body and then placed them like around the scene of the crime.
Why?
That is the question,
Why?
is it not?
Just doesn't make any sense
Doesn't make
why
any
you would do
sense.
that.
Yeah, and some of her organs were missing, and some of them had received like stab wounds. And the other thing is that there were some stab wounds to her external reproductive organs. So that's what I mean when I say sexual component. There seems to be for this killer like a fixation on the reproductive organs. And that's not at all to me sexual, but it
Yeah.
is like a weird fixation for this serial killer to have.
Well, it's like he
So,
also tends to choose sex workers as victims, right?
yes.
So you can
And he
kind of see a
poses them
correlation.
in a
Yeah.
very exposed way. So to me, those are all kind of like indicators that there's maybe some sexual components to these murders. And police were able to tell based on like blood evidence at the scene, just the way the blood had pooled, that she had been like killed where she was. Like when he had slashed her throat and cut her abdomen open, she had been laying on the ground. Like she had not moved from that position. So when he slit her throat, he already had her on the floor, which is weird.
Not
Like you'd
that weird if
think,
he had hired her services, though.
I mean,
I mean, a
yes,
weird
you're not
place to
wrong.
do it in the middle of a street, but also I don't think people were really that,
Yeah,
I
that's true.
mean,
And like,
where else were they
yeah.
supposed to go?
And it's like 3:40 in the morning and it's super dark. So, like I said, no street
Exactly.
lamps. But obviously the people of Whitechapel were horrified by this. Um and unfortunately, it would only be like a little bit over a week before it happened again to somebody else. So, on September 8th, there was a woman named Annie Chapman. At 1:40 a.m., Annie Chapman had been seen at a common lodging house, and she had told the deputy of that lodging house that she didn't have enough money to pay for anything, to pay for her bed for the night, and so she was going to go out and make some money. Like very similar story to Marianne Nichols. It's like literally
Okay,
the
I
same thing.
hate to like divert here, but I am curious. Why are there so many single women? Was there a war going on around this time? Like,
Gosh, that's a good question.
there's all these single women that are like in these common houses, and I'm like, why? Because isn't it
Where are
typical?
their husbands?
Isn't it typical that like women of this time would like live with their parents unless they got married? I mean, I know that some
I
of these
mean,
women were
yes,
divorced,
but
so it's just
I
interesting
mean,
there's this many women living on the streets having to take housing in a common house and become sex workers.
that
I
is
don't know.
weird. I honestly I don't know enough about the climate of things back then to know what was common for this like sort of impoverished person. For for all those people out there, like I me and Lila, we grew up watching A Christmas Carol, the 1980s version of A
Yes.
Christmas Carol every
If you haven't
Christmas.
seen that gym, flick it on this coming Christmas.
Just
It's
watch it
a
for me.
it's a oldie but a goodie. There's a few
It's a
scenes that
goodie.
are really gonna get you going.
Yeah, exactly. And you asked me like what are they doing on the streets? And I just thought of what Ebenezer Scrooge said to the people trying to raise money for the poor. He was like, "Are there are there no jails? Are there no poorhouses?" And I just think these people they probably couldn't afford to live anywhere, and so that means they probably got split up. You know what I mean?
Oh,
Like they
that's
had to
true.
go
Okay,
where
I
there
see
was
what you're
money.
saying. Yeah.
So I bet that some of them were married, and I bet that some of them weren't, and I bet that some were separated or whatever. But I think that it probably didn't matter what their relationship status was. They had to make money for themselves or for their families. And so they just went where they could to do that. I don't know.
Okay, good point. Okay.
That's what I'm picturing, but I could be wrong. Who knows? All right. So Annie Chapman, she just left her common lodging house. She asked the deputy to reserve a bed for her. She was going to be right back. She just had to go make some money, and then she was going to pay for her bed. She was also drunk when she left. Like, literally, this is like a carbon copy of what happened to Marianne Nichols. It's like the exact same thing. She was seen at the corner of Osborne and Whitechapel about an hour later around 2:30, and the witness that saw her was certain that it was 2:30 a.m. because there was a church clock that chimed like right as they saw her, and they were like, it was 2:30. So they know that she was seen at 2:30. And this was the last confirmed place that she was seen. This was about a half mile from where her body was found. And after this, the timing gets a little bit wonky. Um they're not sure at what point she died or was found, because the filing was not really a thing back then. They didn't have file systems, you know. Nothing super helpful. So witnesses say that she was found around 5:30 a.m. Police reports state that she was found at 3:40 a.m. Either way, she was
She's
found
found in the wee hours of the morning.
in the
Okay.
wee hours of the morning. And when police come upon the scene, they realize very quickly that she had been attacked in a very similar way to Marianne Nichols. Just like in Marianne Nichols' case, there was no evidence of a struggle. She had been her throat had been brutally slashed twice, and it had instantly killed her. Her face was swollen and turned to the right, and she had bruising on her right temple and upper eyelid. There were also some distinct bruises on her chest, which were about the size of a man's thumb. I have no idea what that means, but I saw it in multiple sources.
Okay.
That seemed to be something of interest to these investigators, that there were thumb-sized bruises on her chest. And her body had also been posed with her legs drawn up and spread, and her dress pulled up to her stomach. And just like with Marianne Nichols, her abdomen had been cut, and that's kind of unfortunately where the similarities end. Her intestines had been almost completely removed from her body, and they had been placed like above her right shoulder, and a cord had been attached to them.
What?
Yeah, you heard me. It is what it is. I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, they had basically gutted her and put her intestines, like wrapped her intestines in cord and put it above her right shoulder.
Like a gift? Like they just like wrapped it around with like a little.
I don't know if it was like a little bow or anything, but it was just
No, I
wrapped
don't
with
think
cord.
so, but I don't know. That's just weird. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's weird. And then they'd also removed 2 parts of her abdomen and put those above her left shoulder. So that's.
What is the significance
It
of
seems
him
almost
doing
like
that?
he's trying. Yeah, it seems like he's trying to like leave a message of some kind, but it's only a message that his crazy mind can decipher because nobody else knows what he's trying to say. Like, he's doing these intentional things, and it's like there's some sort of like ritual or they mean something to him, but to the rest of the world it's just crazy. Like, nobody understands what's going on.
It's also wild because I understand that like this seems to have happened quickly to the victims, but the aftermath doesn't. I mean, cutting somebody apart like that is not necessarily a quick thing nor an easy thing. You know what I mean? I mean,
No.
wouldn't it take some
Yeah.
time for him to do all of that? not an incredible amount of time, but enough that somebody would have walked by.
You would think so, or heard something. Like, that's not a quiet thing to do that to
No,
somebody. That's
no.
not to be graphic, but like that's going to make sound. It's going to make noise. And based on the fact that these women were all found within 15 minutes of their deaths, all of them, like, you'd think that there'd be people around. Like, if it only takes
Yeah,
15 minutes for their bodies to be found, they can't be that secluded. It's not like he was hiding their bodies. They're just out in the
yeah.
open. It's weird.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you would also think like that the police would have asked like was there nobody else around? Like as they're coming upon the bodies, was there no other witnesses?
Yeah. You, like, literally, you'd
Because
think
he
that
would
they,
have
and they,
literally been walking away from the body covered in
he would have
blood.
had to, or running,
Yeah.
which is just as suspicious. So, yeah, it's kind of crazy. And police they questioned everybody they came in contact with. They canvassed the area. They went door to door for information, but there was just nothing. And they did do some, like, interview some witnesses that had seen her, but nobody had seen her with anybody. A few of these next women, they were seen with a man before they disappeared, but Annie Chapman was not, so they didn't have any leads to go off of at this point.
Okay.
But another interesting thing about that's like unique to Annie's murder is that there were rings that had been like brutally pulled off of her fingers that left like scrapes and stuff on her fingers. And they think that there had been like 2 or 3 rings and they weren't found anywhere at the scene, so it seemed that the killer had taken them with him when he left.
Okay.
So he was like taking things from the bodies, it seems. Or at least with Annie he did. The other odd thing about this scene that was different was that there was a wet leather apron found about 2 feet away from her body. So this is, I think, just based on context clues, where that leather apron murder title came
Yeah,
from.
I mean, I guess it would make sense if he is wearing a leather apron when this happens. Like that's easy to like wipe off, right?
Yeah,
And then just walk down the street like a normal person with hypothetically not that much evidence on you.
exactly. Exactly. But it's weird that he would leave it. That seems
Well,
counterintuitive.
I'm sure it wasn't intentionally.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I wonder if he like
Um,
I'm sure he like was very intensely listening for people.
yeah, I'm sure he
And
was very
then when
aware
he
of his
heard them,
surroundings.
yes, I'm sure he had to get the heck out of Dodge, obviously. Left his
Yeah,
apron behind.
yeah. Um, I wish that that had helped police somehow, but it really didn't. The leather apron really didn't provide much information. And once they'd done an autopsy of Annie's body, there were a few things that they noted. The first was that there were body parts missing from her body.
That's what I
Um,
was gonna ask.
yeah, like part of her abdominal wall, including her navel, were gone. She was also missing part of her uterus, vagina, and bladder, and they just those things had been taken from the scene. So
Wow, okay.
I don't really
He's
understand
keeping some
that.
trophies, I guess.
Yes, it seems that way. I don't. I honestly don't want to know why he needed that to happen. So basically, at this point, now they have 2 of these murders. It's pretty clear that they've got the same guy perpetuating these crimes. So, unfortunately, that didn't stop him from doing the stuff. On September 30th in 1888, another woman was found dead. Her name was Elizabeth Stride. She had been found approximately at 1 a.m. on the morning of September 30th, and she was found lying in a pool of her own blood with her throat slashed, just like the other victims. Her left arm was extended out, and it appeared that she had like a small mint in her hand, a breath freshener. They called it
Okay.
something in Portuguese that I'm just not going to try and pronounce. It's just not worth it. But suffice it to say, it was some sort of breath freshener. They like
Okay.
have a word for it, but I couldn't figure out how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to try. And her legs she'd been posed the same way as the other two victims. Her body was still warm when she was found, just like the other victims. And she had a silk handkerchief wrapped around her throat, which had been torn by the knife that had cut her throat. And just like with the other two victims, there was no sign of a struggle, and there was no murder weapon found at the scene. Some different things, though. There was a piece of paper in her hand. It didn't say anything, apparently, because I couldn't find if there were any words on it or what it was. But she was found with a piece of paper, and she also had like just a bunch of knickknacks with her, and like a thimble and some
I was like,
handkerchiefs.
what kind of knickknacks?
Like the
Okay.
kinds of things that I don't know, maybe most women had a thimble back then in their pocket. I don't know. That's
I
not
mean, the
something I would ever
handkerchief
think, but
wouldn't
handkerchiefs
surprise
make
me, but
sense.
yeah.
A thimble, there was like a pocket comb, I could see that. Um just like some buttons and things like that. So, anyways, yeah, just like random stuff was found with her. And um this woman, Elizabeth Stride, was also known as Long Liz on the street. People knew her as Long Liz. I have no idea why. She was a known sex worker in the area, just like the others, and she was a Swedish immigrant who was about 45 years old, pale complexion, dark hair, just like the other two victims. They all had brown hair. She was about 5'3", and when she was found, she was wearing a black jacket with fur and a red and white flower pinned on it. So, seems like kind of a stylish coat. I don't know. Maybe not. She also had a silk. She was found lying on her left side. Her windpipe had been completely severed from the throat slashing, and it's possible that the murderer may have like used the handkerchief, the scarf that was around her neck, to like pull her backwards and then slit her throat. Um, this case was different from the others because he had been interrupted from mutilating her body, they think,
Oh,
because
okay.
her throat had been slashed, but she had not been mutilated like the other bodies. And so it seems like he'd been in the process of doing what he had done to the other women, and then he had been caught or almost caught, and he'd run for it because that same day, September 30th, they found a second woman who
Oh boy.
had been killed in the same way as the first two victims.
Okay.
So this was like literally 45 minutes later, after 45 minutes after Elizabeth Stride was found dead with her throat slashed, Catherine Eddowes was found dead with her throat slashed and her abdomen mutilated. Catherine had been posed in the same way, and this scene appeared to be a little bit more brutal than the other murders. Um,
So it's almost like he's working under this like need to complete his ritual, to complete yeah, his
yeah, like
thing.
he has to do the throat slashing, and he also has to do the abdomen mutilation. It has to be both, or else it's not good enough. It doesn't fit the bill. And side note, I've been watching like so much Criminal Minds recently, and in Criminal Minds, not that it's fact, but they would say that this is like devolving behavior. Like his crimes are getting worse and worse and more frequent
Right.
and more brutal. And he has to follow his pattern or else he'll freak out. So that's just what Criminal Minds would say, but it seems logical. Um, her throat also had a neckerchief tied around it, just like with a lot of the other victims. Her intestines had been completely removed from her abdomen and like placed over her right shoulder. So just like one of the other victims. But there was no cord for her, just like her intestines. And her right ear had been like cut through. It hadn't been cut off, but there were like deep slashes on it. The autopsy came back and showed that she was missing her left kidney, her uterus, and a couple other things from her abdomen, just like flesh and skin. And at this point, the coroner decided that he didn't think that the person that had done this was very skilled. He didn't think that they were like a doctor because of how like jagged and rushed and stuff all these cuts were. I don't know if I agree with that because like if you're even if you're really good at something, not that anybody should be good at cutting people open, but even if you're really good at something, if you're in a rush and you know you could be caught at any second and you absolutely have to get something done and not get caught, I don't think that you're like at your top skill level. I think when you're rushed, things just like happen. You just do it as fast as you can. You're not trying to be perfect. You're just trying to get it done.
Yeah.
And so,
And you would think that, like, especially for like the late 1800s, I am unsure if it would be common knowledge about human anatomy. You know what I mean? I mean, I don't think
yeah.
it was common knowledge what was what inside of a human being. I
Yeah.
definitely, even now, could not cut somebody open and tell you what was what. And
That's what
he
I
seems to be
think.
taking specific body parts.
Yeah, he always takes like kidneys and uteruses and things like that. Like he takes specific things. He doesn't just take like random organs. So it is weird to me. Like I don't think if I was faced with human organs, I'd be able to tell you what they are and which things to take. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah, and
weird
I
that
don't
he
even think I
consistently
would.
takes the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't consistently be able to take a kidney. I'm sure I would mix it up with a spleen
Yeah.
or a something else in there. I don't even know.
Yeah, exactly. So that's super weird. Um and on top of like him taking her organs, which is horrible, um she had also her face had also been mutilated. So he
Oh,
had like cut her face several different times, cheeks, the bridge of her nose. Part of her nose was gone. Her lip had been cut off. Um,
gee.
so just like it just seemed like an escalation. Like he was very upset. It seemed. Um, she'd also been like received stab wounds, which hadn't happened since like the first victim. There were stab wounds to her liver and to her groin, and her left kidney had been carefully removed. Like they could tell that there had been effort put into not damaging the left kidney
Hmm.
and the uterus that had been taken.
Okay.
So, same deal. They think that it was a sharp, long knife that had been used to commit these horrible, horrible acts. So, super crazy back to back murders there. Um, like literally within 45 minutes. It's pretty
Yeah.
baffling to me that that happened and nobody saw
Anything again.
anything valuable ever. So with Catherine Eddowes, she had been like one detail about her scene that was different was that her apron had been cut and a piece of it had been taken, and they actually found that piece of her apron about an hour after they found her body.
Really?
So they found it on a different street, and they found it underneath some graffitied words on the wall. And I'm not sure this phrase always seems to be connected with it. I'm not like police weren't sure whether it had been written by the killer or if it had just like accidentally happened to fall. Like it
Right
wasn't
next to
uncommon
that.
for there to be graffiti on the walls. And so they were like he either wrote this or it just fell out of what like his hands or whatever, and then this phrase was there already. But I'll read the phrase because it could be part of it. I don't think it is. The phrase was, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing."
The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing.
If that's not nonsense, I don't know what is. So, cool. I don't know
Okay.
what that means.
I don't think that has anything to do with anything.
I don't think that has anything to do with this, but it's always like all the sources I saw, they always mention it. So I'm just going to mention it. So the final woman that was killed to me breaks from previous victimology. I'm using a Criminal Minds word in case you missed that. She
Yeah.
So all of the previous victims were in their 40s. They had dark hair, they were white. They looked pretty similar to each other, just kind of like he seemed to have a type or that just happened to be a coincidence. I have no idea. But they all were around the same age and they had the same hair color. And they were all found with like handkerchiefs either around their necks or on their body somewhere, which I think is probably just a thing of the
The
time. I
time.
bet that was just
Yeah.
like a style thing to have a handkerchief around your neck. And handkerchiefs are useful. So I bet they had them on their like on them when they were killed. But this last woman, Marianne Kelly, she kind of broke pattern a little bit. Um because she was 24-ish. So she was
Okay, so
much younger.
significantly younger.
Yes. She was taller. She was 5'7". All these other women, the tallest one was 5'3". So she was like 4 inches taller, which is like, that probably could be a coincidence. She was also blonde, so different hair color. So just kind of like a break in the pattern there. Like not what the other women had been like, had looked like.
Okay.
So Marianne Kelly, she was a known sex worker in the area, and she lived in an apartment, which is different. She lived on the ground floor of a 3-story house, and she was actually found in her apartment, not on the streets.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that is
And
different.
that is not the only difference. This crime scene was by far the most brutal of the 5.
Which I hate to
If
say
you
would make sense if you're in an enclosed space and nobody's going to happen upon you.
Yeah, and he has more
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
right.
And he used that time. Like it's gory. So, um just like with the previous victim, she was found lying on her back with her legs spread, but she was actually found on her bed, not on like the ground. And just to premise this, so much of her flesh had been removed that in some parts of her body only her skeleton was left.
Oh
So
my
he had
gosh.
like really, really mutilated her body. Um, her nose and ears had been cut off. One or more of her organs was missing from her body. Actually, all of the organs from her abdomen had been removed. He didn't leave any of her organs intact. Some of them were left on her bedside table. Some of them were spread out around her body on the bed. Both of her breasts had been cut off. And like he went from being like horrible to being like the devil himself. Like
Yeah.
he just mutilated this woman's body. She had been her throat had been cut, so that was her cause of death. He did that before he mutilated her body, which doesn't seem like a mercy, but I feel like it is at the same time. That she didn't have to like live through all of that craziness.
It's also like logistically, not to get graphic, but I don't think you could do all those things to a living person.
No, I mean they would die at some point in the process.
Well, even if you tried to like restrain them, you're not going to be able to accomplish what you're trying to do.
Oh no.
So luckily, I think he had to kill them first.
Yeah. And I think like, I mean, that's obviously part of his MO. Like he doesn't really care if they're alive. He wants them to be dead. Like he kills them first. So her uterus and kidneys were found along with one of her breasts underneath her head. He'd put them like underneath her head, like a sick pillow or something.
What?
Yeah. And her other breast was found by her right foot, along with her liver. Her intestines had been placed on her right side, her spleen on the left side of her body. The skin from her thighs and the flesh from her thighs had been completely removed. Her face was unrecognizable. Basically, yeah, he had just like totally ruined this woman's body after he killed her. And the thing that stuck out to police the most is that he had carefully removed her heart. They could tell he'd taken great care in removing her heart, and it was missing from the crime scene. He'd taken it with him.
I truly don't even have any words. That is so horrifying.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible. So, yeah, and there's more, but if you're really that interested, you can go read exactly everything, but I don't really want to do that. So, that was the final of the canonical 5. Marianne Kelly, she was the last victim. So there are a lot of similarities, right, between all of these murders. They're all killed with their throats slashed. They're all mutilated. They're all posed in the same way. There are some slight differences, like Marianne Kelly's much younger. Obviously, her crime scene was much more brutal. Catherine Eddowes was actually not a sex worker. She actually made money by cleaning the streets for business owners in the area. So, like, that was different. But if you think about it, like, he tried to kill Elizabeth Stride, and he had, but he hadn't gotten to complete whatever sick ritual he's trying to complete. And so he goes and he kills Catherine Eddowes. And it seems like he just literally picked the first woman that he saw on the street to victimize. So I don't think he was doing his normal sex worker thing. And we'll talk more about it in the next episode. That's right. It's a 2-parter. But it's possible that the sex workers were just like a convenient, easy way to get victims, as is often the case with serial killers that target sex workers. But some people believe that it was more of a like vendetta against sex workers based on some of his communications. So kind of weird that if it was like his typical victimology that he would break pattern and kill Catherine Eddowes, but it's also like he seemed to be in a rush trying to find a second victim to do what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
So,
wow. Gruesome.
Anyways,
very brutal.
That's where we're gonna end. Next episode won't be anywhere near that horrible. It's over. We're going to talk next episode about some other women that may have been killed by Jack the Ripper, that were killed in 1888. We're going to talk about some of the letters that police received from Jack the Ripper. We're going to talk about suspects and theories and all that fun stuff. So it'll be a little bit lighter next episode.
The good stuff, not the heavy
interesting stuff. Yeah. So apologies that it was so heavy at the beginning, but you're going to be thanking me next week when you're like, oh, this is way more interesting. I'm glad we don't have to think about that anymore. You're welcome. This is my tip of the week. How I Met Your Mother, if anybody's ever watched that sitcom, they say in that nothing good ever happens after midnight. And I agree with that. Like, just don't be on the streets after midnight. And then you have a better chance of not being horribly, horribly hurt. That's my tip. Take it or leave it.
There you go. Stay frosty, y'all. See you next week.
Bye.